By the time the first snow came hissing sideways across the high valley, the calves were sold, the hay was stacked in the loft, and every porch rail for 20 miles had cords of split lodgepole pine leaning against it like tired soldiers. Winter on the High Divide didn't care if a man was ready or not. It only cared that he learned quickly. On the McCrae place, 160 acres of short grass and scattered sage, the preparations looked the same as they'd always looked. The old ranch house squatted low to the wind, its tin roof already singing with sleet, and a narrow log cabin sat 50 yards off, up against a windbreak of Russian olives and scrub cottonwoods. Smoke drifted from both chimneys, blue against the gray. Inside the ranch house, Dale McCrae hunched at the kitchen table over a chipped stoneware mug in the latest propane bill. The numbers on the paper had a way of climbing higher every winter, like the drifts that piled up against the barn doors. "It ain't right," he muttered, dragging a calloused thumb down the column. "We live on top of 1,000,000 acres of fuel, and I'm paying some fella in a necktie more money every darn year just to keep from freezing." His son, Luke, leaned against the counter, watching the steam curl up from the coffee pot. 28 now, with the easy shoulders of a man who'd thrown plenty of hay, and the quick eye of one who'd read more than just brand books and sale bills, he had the same dark hair as his father and the same tendency to squint when he was thinking. "You could burn more wood, use less propane," he said. "You barely touch that stove these days." Dale snorted. "Yeah, if I wanted to spend all day like my granddad, chopping and hauling, I could. But then who's going to fix the south fence or chase the cows that keep crawling through the creek bottom, huh? Propane's supposed to be the easy part of winter." Luke took a breath, feeling the moment coming around again, the way it had 3 times already since he'd moved back home that fall. "Or," he said carefully, "you could let me build the heater I've been talking about." His father's eyes rolled so hard it looked like it might hurt. "Here we go. Boy goes off, takes 2 semesters of ag engineering and drops out, and now he's going to reinvent fire. I got a perfectly good wood stove." "In 1979 it was perfectly good," Luke said. "Half your heat's going up the chimney, and you got to sleep in the living room to stay warm. Let me build it in the cabin, prove it works, then—" "Nope." That wasn't even listening. I listened the first 3 times. Dale flattened the bill on the table, as if he could press the numbers down. "This manure heater thing is nonsense. Heating your house with compost. That's what you're saying, ain't it? Piles of cow crap." "Not just manure," Luke protested. "Manure and straw and wood chips. It's called a gene pain system. They've been doing it in France since the 70s. It's not—" "France," Dale's lip curled. "Last I checked, this wasn't France. This is Wyoming. It gets -40 here if you make God mad enough. You start running hoses through piles of wet poop, everything's going to freeze solid by Christmas." "It won't freeze," Luke said, trying to keep his voice even. He knew the science by heart now, could recite the numbers of bacteria and BTUs like scripture. Compost piles can hit 140 degrees easy. The bacteria make heat as they break down the material. You run water through coiled pipe in the pile, circulate it through the cabin, and— "Son," Dale laid the bill down and finally met his eyes. "I've been heating this place since before you were a thought in my head. We burned coal, we burned wood, we burned some mystery fuel the co-op sold us one year that smelled like the devil's own armpit, but I ain't never once thought, you know what'd be nice? Bringing a giant pile of hot manure into my life." Luke bit back a laugh because it was either that or start shouting. "It doesn't go inside. It's outside, near the cabin, enclosed in a big round bale ring, insulated. The only thing that comes in is the heat." Dale shook his head. "Crazy. Plain crazy. Neighbor Earl already thinks you're odd since you put that plastic on your south windows in September. You start building an altar of cow pies out there, he's going to call the sheriff, get you committed." "Earl thinks microwaves are witchcraft," Luke pointed out. "That don't make him wrong about you," Dale said, but there was a ghost of a smile on his mouth. He sighed, long and slow. "Look, you want to mess around in that cabin, that's your business, but I'm not paying for pipe, and I'm certainly not spending my weekends helping you build a giant compost donut." "I already bought most of the pipe," Luke said quickly. "Picked up a couple 100 feet of old PEX from the salvage yard in town. Got 2 IBC totes for free off Jim at the co-op. We have all the manure we want. I'm just asking permission to make a mess for a while." Dale studied him for a moment. Outside, the wind rattled the kitchen window, and somewhere a hinge squealed its rusty complaint. "You think it'll work?" Luke swallowed. "I know it will." "That confident, huh?" He nodded. "Fine," Dale said, "but you don't get to steal my firewood when you find yourself freezing out there with your science experiment. You get cold, you come to the house, you admit I was right. I'll let you sleep on the couch and I won't say I told you so. Out loud, anyway." Luke grinned. "Deal." The very next day, the valley awoke to a hard, crystalline cold. The snow had stopped in the night, leaving the world scoured and bright. Luke stepped out of the cabin and the air slapped his lungs, the kind of cold that felt sharp in the nose and made your eyelashes tack together. He could see his breath in thick bursts as he walked down to the calving shed. The corrals were a dull patchwork of trampled snow and dark shapes. The cows watched him with mild curiosity as he fired up the bobcat and began scooping the winter's worth of manure out of the loafing area. "Never thought I'd see the day a man moved cow pies on purpose when he didn't have to," came a dry voice from the fence line. Luke straightened and saw Earl Kinnaman perched there, mittens hooked in the barbed wire, his Carhartt coat splotched with something that might have been last summer's paint or this morning's coffee. Earl's property backed up to the McCrae's north line. He had a cabin like theirs, a few Angus cattle, and a propensity for opinions. "Morning, Earl," Luke called. "Just trying to get ahead on spring cleaning." "In November?" Earl shook his head. "Your daddy always said book learning made a man stupid, but I didn't believe him till now." Luke tamped down a reply. Instead, he just scooped another bucket full of manure and trundled it up to the spot he'd staked out near the cabin, where the snow had been scraped away in a rough circle. The bale ring waited there, an open metal hoop on bare ground. By noon, he'd formed the first crude layer, a ring of dense, steaming muck and straw, tamped down by the bobcat's tires. The smell, sharp and familiar, hung heavy despite the cold. "Smells like money," is what ranchers usually said about manure. "Smells like you've lost your mind," is what Earl actually said when he wandered up closer. Luke climbed down from the machine, his cheeks raw and red. "Building a compost heater," he said. "Gonna run hot water through it to warm the cabin." Earl blinked. "You're gonna heat your house with poop?" "Yeah, pretty much." A grin slowly split the old man's face. "Well, ain't that something? Gonna roast marshmallows over it, too?" "Not that kind of heat." For 3 days, he worked on the pile, mixing buckets of manure with straw, old hay, sawdust, and chipped brush from the windbreak trees he'd trimmed. Between each foot of new material, he snaked a coil of black PEX pipe, looping it around and around the ring, so that in the end, the pipe made a spiral from the ground up to shoulder height. When he finally lashed the last tarp over the top and packed snow around the base like frosting on a giant, ugly cake, he stepped back and regarded his work. The ring was full to overflowing, a glistening, lumpy cylinder taller than he was, slightly steaming in the sub-freezing air. The two ends of the PEX pipe stuck out like the necks of restless black snakes, one destined to feed into an insulated water tank in the cabin, the other to return. Dale only came out once during the construction, hands jammed in his coat, face unreadable. "That's something," he said at last. "It'll start heating in a day or two," Luke said, more to convince himself than his father. "You tell those microbes they're welcome to stay outside. You start having 1,000 little hot flashes in that cabin, you come knock on my door." Inside the cabin, Luke had done his best to set up a simple system. The two IBC totes sat stacked against an interior wall, boxed in with leftover insulation board forming a rough thermal battery. He plumbed the coil from the manure pile into the bottom of the lower tank, out the top into the cabin's half-dozen salvaged baseboard radiators, then back to the top of the pile. The whole thing was driven by a cheap little circulator pump he'd picked up used, powered through a battery he could recharge with a small solar panel he'd mounted on the southern eave. He did all the soldering on the rickety kitchen table, his breath fogging in front of him, fingers clumsy from cold. It wasn't pretty, any real plumber would have wept, but it didn't leak, and that was enough. The first night after he closed up the pile, he slept in his clothes under 2 quilts and a sleeping bag, the old steel wood stove ticking as it burned its last meager load of scrap. Outside, the temperature dropped to 9 below. Inside, it hovered just above freezing. He could see his breath when he woke to check the thermometer hanging on the wall by the door. 35 degrees. "Come on, microbes," he whispered to the dark, rubbing his hands together. "Earn your keep." On the second day, when he trudged out to the pile to check the cheap compost thermometer he jammed halfway into the mass, the needle had crept from ambient up to 70 degrees. On the third day, it hit 90. By day 5, it was pegged at 130, and the end of the return pipe coming back into the cabin was warm to the touch. He met his father's skeptical stare with one of his own. "Told you it wouldn't freeze." "That ain't heating the house," Dale countered. "That's taking the chill off water. Call me when it's taking the chill off your bones." So he waited. The first real test came a week later when the clouds rolled in low and leaden, and the local weatherman on the battery-powered radios started using phrases like Arctic front and record lows. Neighbors called each other on crackling landlines in the way of people who'd lived through enough winters to know that danger often came wrapped in something as simple as cold air. Earl stopped by to say he'd filled all his propane bottles and brought in extra wood. "Y'all got enough split?" he asked, glancing pointedly